stand here and listen to this baloney. You won't float. He doesn't stand for baloney.
Sounds like a lot of supernatural baloney to me.
Supernatural, perhaps. Baloney, perhaps not.
Good evening and welcome. You're tuned into the best in paranormal talk radio. This is Darkness Radio presents Holzer's Ghosts. Tonight we're going to take a look at an interesting case, one that has been asked of us on Holzer Files since the show started. When are you going to Amityville? When will we get to see the team investigate the supernatural at the Mecca haunted house in America? And the question is never. But we decided to do the next best thing. We'll get into the intricacies of why you won't see a Holzer Files episode at the Amityville house. We'll do that as the show progresses tonight. We've got a lot of great guests that are going to be joining us in just a few moments. I want you to know this is great. I'm so happy. This is, I think, our largest panel discussion, and everybody that's coming on board has their ideas, their theories, their concepts of what happened in Amityville. But everybody's agreed to come in and talk and be polite and kind. We expect you, the listeners and live viewers, to do the same. So be courteous to one another in the chat room, and feel free to ask questions as the show gets into it. At first, we're going to be focused on introducing and getting everybody going, and then we will do our best to bring in your questions and incorporate them through tonight's program. Now, when we discuss Amityville, obviously everybody has a memory of when they were introduced to Amityville. I remember mine clearly. I remember seeing Jay Anson's book sitting on the kitchen counter, and I went over and there was this giant fly on the cover, and I looked at it and I'm like, what is this book about, Mom? Were there a lot of flies in this house? And she started to tell me this story, and I remember it freaking me completely out, which it did to many people, right? You read this book, this novelization based on true story, and it is one of the most chilling and compelling ghost stories ever told. This got me thinking as I grew older and began doing Darkness Radio. Amityville was one of the cases I knew that we had to dive deep into. I wanted to try to get to different aspects, and boy, did I. Tim Yancey, one of our guests tonight, one of our longtime friends of the show, I think was one of the first, if not the first Amityville guest we ever had. And that show is available right now in our Darkhives. As a matter of fact, if you go to Stitcher.com and the Darkness Radio program, go into our Darkhives, you can find Tim Yancey's first appearance, and I think around 2008, talking about Amityville. That led to an introduction to Christopher Quarantino, formerly Christopher Lutz, the youngest boy and youngest surviving child of the Lutz family that lived in Amityville. And that started a very long friendship. Now I think about 10 years, 12 years we've been friends. Christopher, I believe you're out there watching tonight. He couldn't join us this evening, but he is watching. So thank you very much, Christopher, for the stories you've shared with me, the stories you've shared with the public at live events. We appreciate that. But what more is there to understand? Well, there's a great documentary called The Amityville Horror House that's now on Discovery Plus. It's one of their shock docs. And you're going to recognize a lot of my guests this evening from that shock doc. If you have not watched it, please go check it out. It is a great documentary and certainly looks into many different aspects of the program. Although it is a shock doc, they don't talk much about the hoax aspect. What is the story behind the hoax? We're going to dive into that tonight. And I know everybody's got opinions on that as well. But I wanted to start off with kind of a gem, something really I found very interesting. This, believe it or not, when I was working behind the scenes on Ghost Adventures, I was working to, try to find locations, find things that at one time we were really seriously trying to acquire the Amityville Horror House. And we were looking up and doing some research. Was there anything else out there, any stone that we could kick over? And believe it or not, one of the lead researchers uncovered something that he shared with me. And this, I'm going to show you, first of all, a widescreen shot of this. This is from the New York Herald, dated Sunday, August 7th, 1887, almost 100 years before the famous story. Now, if you notice over on the far side, you'll see Salubrious Amityville is the headline, a peaceful spot where the people die of old age. And then there's just this myriad of weird little topics. And let's get a zoom in on that aspect. This is what I found impressive. Over 100 years ago, this article came out. There is a haunted house. Amityville possesses a haunted house. No one knows why it is so called, but it is known as such, and that settles it. It is a place of valuable property situated on the banks of a pretty lake, half a mile from the beach. It was bought some years ago by a New York party who fitted it up handsomely and prepared it for occupancy in every way, but never occupied it, and has ever since let it fall into ruins. Its vast garden is full of wild weeds. Its portico has become rickety. Its Grecian columns are tumbling down, and its general appearance is weird and forsaken. And then that's pretty much the end of that aspect of the story. And then it just rolls into other little aspects of Amityville. But here we have, and I just love the very matter-of-fact nature of journalism back then. There is a house in Amityville that is haunted. No one knows why, but it is. So just accept that. And that was something I thought was great. I've never once seen that referenced in any of the TV shows, documentaries, or books. But suddenly we start to see that maybe there is something to this. And it sounds remarkably like a house that is positioned near the water in Amityville and has this crazy haunting. So powerful is the haunting that the man that built it refused to live in it. Is that possible? What do we know about the past? Well, Dr. Hans Holzer loved history, and he loved to dive deep into the stories. He was introduced into this case and certainly wrote quite extensively on the program, did documentaries on it. You saw him on many different TV shows discussing it. And we do have a video clip from the news from Dr. Holzer's investigation we're going to play in a bit so that you can hear in his own words about some of the findings. But what he was most fascinated about was the land, the history of the land. That's where he centered a lot of his investigation. And we'll talk about that. We have some great guests that were there on hand when Dr. Holzer visited. So let's get to it. We'll introduce our illustrious cast right now. Ladies and gentlemen, you know her from the Holzer Files. You love her as a paranormal author. She is also a paranormal investigator following I don't like to say following the footsteps because, again, that sounds dismissive as if she hasn't cut her own path, and she certainly has. Alexandra Holzer, good friend of our show, and she is back. Alex, thank you so much for coming on tonight.
Thanks for having me.
Talking about your father's fascination with history in this area, do you remember how he got introduced to this story and this haunting?
I do. I honestly was clueless to what was going on. We always visited Long Island, and when you're driving on the LIE, you pass the towns. When you get far enough, you see Amityville. So it's got the letters in grass, kind of like its own little Hollywood, if you will, but it's just like flat. And I always thought it was really pretty to look at. And I didn't know years later what that town represented to my father. So he basically had read about the story in the Times and later on was contacted to go out and do an investigation because apparently there's reports that it was potentially haunted. And he chose medium Ethel Johnson Mayers to go with him. And so that's how that all began. But he didn't, it's like one of those things where it finds him, like in life, things find us. It's not always that we put it out there. Sometimes it just kind of comes to us for a reason. And so that was one of those cases because there was a lot of history there that needed to be told and which got lost, as you can see over the decades in the storytelling and so forth. So
right. And tonight we're going to be able to talk about some of those aspects, some of the things that your father was openly mocked about at the time of his investigations, being dismissed as not knowing his history. When I love the video clip we're going to show, you can see how in control your father was, and he knew what he was doing. Joining us as well on tonight's program is a journalist who had boots on the ground at the time of this haunting, was one of the people that helped to put this story out there and get the story in front of many people. She had a chance to work with the Lutz family, with Hans Holzer and Ethel Johnson Myers, and also with Ed Lorraine Warren. We're going to introduce now to the program Laura DiDio. Thank you so much for being here today.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Laura, what was it like, if you could, I want to take it back a little bit further. What was it like in Long Island, Amityville at the time of the DeFeo murders? Can you kind of tell us a little bit about the community before the murder and then what it was like when it hit?
Sure. Well, it was a bedroom community, middle to upper middle class with some rich people. It was very insular. I mean, and it was bucolic in a way. Everybody knew everybody. You had access to the ocean, to the lake there, the river. So all in all, it was a very, very nice place. There were a lot of at the time in the 70s, we didn't have such a secular society. And as you'll see with Amityville, there's a strong religious overtones and undertones, with especially Catholicism that runs through this. So, but at the time of the murders in 1974, I was actually in college at Fordham University. I had a radio show called Dimension, where I first interviewed Hans Holzer. And I was also working as a weekend intern for the then Long Island Press. So when that story hit, when the murders hit, I was working at the in the little press office that was out at the police headquarters there. It was huge news. You hadn't had, I think there was maybe one murder in 100 years in Amityville. So when you had a sextuple murder, that was big news, and it was very, very shocking.
Well, especially at the start, because the story goes that Ronald Butch DeFeo Jr. came home to find his family slain and then ran back to the bar to tell everybody, and it became this deal. How long was it, in your recollection, from the time he made that claim to the time he was arrested for the murders?
It was only about like 40 hours. So within 2 days, the detectives there in Suffolk County, the homicide detectives, pretty much made him pretty quickly for the murders. Things didn't add up. He concocted a story in which first he was blaming mafia hitmen. Then, it was a robbery gone wrong, but they quickly, zeroed in on him, and the detective who basically got him to confess over a 9-hour period, finessed it. Tell me, Ronnie, tell me. And one of the things Ronnie Butch DeFeo was most worried about in confessing was having to face his grandfather, his maternal grandfather, Mike Briganti, whom he said, he's got ins with the cops that, he's going to do something to me. Can you protect me? But at the time, once he did confess, and he was very emotional throughout the interrogation, when the cop asked him, why did you do it? Why did you kill all these people? And this is the truest truism. You figure less than 48 hours after the murders. He said, once it started, I just couldn't stop. It happened so fast. But even after he confessed, and there were some very, very gory details. For instance, when he shot his younger brother, who had been injured playing football at the local elementary school, that kid, John, really needed a wheelchair to get around and crutches because he had injured his leg very badly. So when he shot him in the back, it severed his spine. And Ronnie talked about how he stood there and watched his brother die with his leg twitching.
Oh my God.
So that's very horrific.
Well, looking into this, was there a lot of panic in the town for that 40 hours before they knew what happened? Were people worried that they might be next?
No, there wasn't that type of panic because it was an isolated incident. It was more like shock. And I think even before it was announced that Ronnie had confessed and was publicly charged with the crime and arraigned, everybody in and around town had figured, it's only a matter of time before, they get Ronnie for it, because he had been just, within the law, but you knew he was going to cross over that line. He was a punk. His parents gave him money. He was spoiled. He was an addict. And the DeFeos had come from Brooklyn, so they never really fit into the neighborhood. They were loud, they were boisterous, they were Italian. They had loud fights inside the house, outside the house, and Ronnie was pretty well known. Now his siblings were very, very well liked and not like him at all.
Well, talking about this case, one of the things that we're going to introduce another guest in just a second here. One of the things that threw me, I remember visiting Amityville about 10 years ago. We were in New York to film for another project in Long Island, and the lady at the home said, the Amityville house is right down the road from us. So, of course, being paranormal enthusiasts, we drove down to check out the house. And I think we just walking in front of the house for 3 seconds, we must have had 20 cars stop and get the fuck out of here. Nobody needs you. And I was like, geez, we're just stopping to look at the house for a second. They were not happy that we were there and bringing this attention. And we weren't with a camera crew or anything. It was just a little gaggle of 4 or 5 of us. But we stopped. What threw me was all of these movies, every portrayal had this house kind of set off on its own, this mysterious house up on the hill, far away from other homes. And then I realized just how close. And I started looking at older pictures and realized it hasn't changed. And then the concept that this man could go in and murder an entire family without anybody hearing a thing. How is that even possible? So why don't we throw to our next guest? Blaine Duncan is a fellow Minnesotan. He is a paranormal investigator, historian, and researcher, and he has spent a good portion of his time researching the DeFeo family, the murder, the story, and the history behind it. So, Blaine, I know you've had a chance, and we're going to get into this a little later, to visit the Amityville house a number of years ago, like 5-6 years ago, and do many different things. But I want to keep it to the murder aspect of it right now. When this question arises, I'm not a gun guy. I'll be honest with you. I'm not a hunter. I know I don't know how they let me stay in Minnesota not being a hunter, but I'm not a hunter. How do you murder 6 people with a very powerful, I think it was a rifle. Is that right?
It was a 35 caliber Marlin rifle. Yeah. And that really is the ultimate question with this case is when you look at the houses and the way that they're positioned on that street, they're relatively close. And the idea that everyone slept through this, that the neighbors slept through this, that the DeFeo family themselves slept through this is really one of the greatest mysteries in this case. So looking at it from that perspective, that's where some believe there was some paranormal activity that was occurring at that point in time, and that perhaps was part of the reason why the shots themselves were muffled. And there's also people out there who actually claim that they may have actually heard something that night, that not only did neighbors hear the DeFeo's dog barking, but during my research, I was actually able to talk with a fellow or a local Amityville resident who said that she was actually spending the night next door. And she claims that there was more to it than what was ever actually reported, and that the shots were actually heard, but due to the connections with the mafia that the DeFeo family supposedly had, which has been pretty well documented throughout the years, that people just didn't want to get involved, that they knew there could be more to this case than what was initially meeting the eye, what people were initially seeing. And ultimately they chose not to speak up until many years later.
Well, we also have to set the time frame. When did this murder occur? What time of year?
It was November. So it was November 13th, 1974. This is Amityville, New York. So the weather was fairly decent for that time, but the murders themselves actually occurred sometime in the middle of the night. The official incidents has the murders happening at about 3:15 in the morning on November 13th. And that was when the DeFeo's dog was reportedly heard barking wildly by a neighbor boy. Now, unfortunately, in my life, I had neighbors in an apartment that burned to death a door away from me. How can you not hear gunshots going off in a house next door? If the rooms are insular and they're not easily exposed, you might not hear that. And if you're sleeping, you might not hear that. I was sleeping 15, 20 feet away from 3 people pounding on their door because they couldn't get out, and the fire engulfed them and killed them. And I felt so much guilt over the next few days that how could I not have heard that? How could I not have? It's right there. It's
20, 30 feet tops away from my door. And in an apartment complex, the walls are not that thick. So some of it, I understand the concept of, could it be paranormal? Something that was truly demonic helping Butch DeFeo, which kind of played into what the stories were that he tried to build upon later. But it is easy to realize how many things happen. And again, folks, you got to remember, the Manson family were extremely good at getting into people's homes and moving furniture and doing things while people slept in the home. It's when you're sleeping, and if you're a deep sleeper or maybe a fan sleeper like I am, you might not hear anybody in the house, right? So there's a lot of things at play. We can't jump immediately to the supernatural, although it is kind of bizarre, and that none of the family, now that explains why neighbors might not have heard it or reported it. How loud is a rifle like that, Blaine, when it's being shot?
Yeah, it should have been heard from several blocks away, easily several blocks away. And again, wow, this house is, it's fairly close to the neighboring houses. So like I said, that's really one of the greatest mysteries with this case, is how nobody supposedly heard anything, especially within the house itself, how nobody got up out of their beds and attempted to fight back.
With that said, I believe there was one sister that apparently had what they call defensive wounds. Is that right?
I think you're referring to Dawn DeFeo, who was 18 years old. So she would have been the next youngest after Ronnie. And she had what was described as unburned gunpowder that was found on her nightgown. Now, there's a couple different ideas. There are a couple different theories. One is that she did, in fact, fire a rifle that night. And the other idea is that she was just within such a close range that when the rifle went off, that unburned gunpowder was actually able to find its way onto her nightgown. But that is one of the things that's been thrown out there. And again, one of the mysteries of this case.
Laura, I noticed when I brought that aspect up, you kind of shook your head. I know there's a lot of false narratives and red herrings throughout this story. What do you know about that aspect?
Well, when I interviewed the detectives and also the medical examiner, basically they attributed the gunpowder on Dawn to the fact that the proximity. She was shot right in the face. There was no gunpowder or residue on her hands. And of course, one of the reasons that this narrative that Dawn was somehow involved and an accomplice or also murdered some of the family members, that got started by Ronnie. And he kept repeating that, over 46 years until he died, last month. But there was no evidence. In fact, both Dawn and Allison, the 13-year-old, their murders were particularly gruesome because they were shot point blank in the face. And when the Lutzes moved in, there was still brain matter and blood on the walls.
Blaine, that makes sense then too, with the narrative of the gunpowder on her nightgown, right? If he was up at that close a distance, there would be some spray from the gun, correct? Which would leave unburned powder.
It certainly could. Yeah, it certainly could. And so Dawn was actually shot in the back of the neck, in the base of her skull. So the question has always been, where is this unburned gunpowder? Is it on the front of her? Because she was found on her stomach. So that would indicate there's no way that gunpowder would be able to get on her. Was it on her back shoulder? And those are just some of the questions that we've never been able to answer, because that nightgown has never been tested up until today. So again, one of the great mysteries of this story.
Now, we know that Ronnie DeFeo Jr. tried to claim this mysterious force brought him a gun and encouraged him to murder the family. Not getting into that debate of the subject, but do we know, and Laura, we'll start with you on this, do we know, were there any reports of paranormal activity while the DeFeo family lived there? Did any of them, aside from Butch, ever talk about this openly?
Well, what had happened, the family was religious, and Ronnie tried to actually kill his father almost a year before the actual murders. Okay. And he took a gun and he tried, rifle, he tried to shoot his father, and it jammed. And after that, Ronnie Sr., Big Ronnie, really got religion in a big way, not just the statues on the lawn, but he began to send money up to a Canadian monk and give donations. And he basically told people this was very well known within the family and within their circle of friends. He says, "Boy, I dodged a bullet. I have the devil on my back here, and I dodged a bullet." And the DeFeos did have a mass said in the house. Now, one of the things that arose, and I've never been able to confirm this, is that supposedly, while the mass was being said, a wind arose despite the fact that all of the windows were closed and blew out the candles. But again, I've never been able to independently confirm or corroborate that version. But it was not unusual in those days to have a priest, a parish priest, come by and say masses at a home,
Right.
at a private home. So especially in the 70s, when you figure things were, we were much more religious and church going as a society as a whole.
Blaine, any accounts from the families preceding the DeFeos about a haunting taking place in this home, or from the DeFeos that you're aware of, aside from this feeling of, I need to be blessed, we need to get, something seems to be affecting our family? Were they specifically thinking it was something dark and demonic, or were they just trying to clear the palate because they knew that Ronnie DeFeo Jr. had tried to kill his father earlier?
Yeah, so I've never been able to confirm anything that the DeFeos had any sort of paranormal activity occurring inside the house. I've interviewed probably well over a dozen people who knew the family well, friends of the children. Luis DeFeo's one of Luis DeFeo's best friends, and they all claim that the supposed paranormal activity inside the home was not real. Or at least it was not real at the time that the DeFeos did live there. I was able to track down one of the family members of a family member who lived there before the DeFeos, and I just wanted to confirm with them too that there was, what was happening. Was it a strange house? Were there weird things that were going on inside that house prior to what we know the Lutz story today? And they too never were able to confirm anything, that it was just a normal house up until that point, and that really up until the DeFeo family murders, Amityville was just sort of your typical place that people could enjoy living in, a nice seaside village.
All right. Our next guest that we'll introduce, again, a longtime friend of the show, a paranormal investigator, researcher, and friend to George Lutz, Tim Yancey, is here with us. Hello, Tim. Good to see you again, buddy. Timmy, can you hear me?
Hey, everyone. Hey,
There
Dave.
we go.
Thanks for having me.
So, Tim,
I'm here.
We now know about the murders. We know that there was really no call for the paranormal before the Lutz family moves in. And talk to us quickly so that the audience knows when you did become friends with George Lutz. It was obviously after everything that had happened. How long after before you and George became familiar?
Well, George and the family had moved out to California, and around the same time that was going on, when I was a kid, I was living in a haunted house, and we were having phenomenon going on in my home. That became the basis for some of the documentaries that are out there. My particular one was called The Shadow Man. In an effort to try to understand what was happening to our family, you would go out there into libraries, places like that, and try to find information about ghosts and hauntings, and there wasn't anything out there. There were a couple of new people named Ed and Lorraine Warren, who had just started writing books, and there was a guy named Hans Holzer who was out there, and that was it. You couldn't find anything. You didn't have the internet, those kind of things. So we found the book, The Amityville Horror. Written by Jay Anson. And there are so many commonalities in that. My family, my mom actually, is the one that wrote the publishing company and said, listen, we need help. And this is what's going on. Somehow they forwarded it. This was when I was really young, so I'm not sure of all the particulars there. But the Lutz family answered back. George answered back and started a conversation and a dialogue with my family. So from that, George and I became friends over the years. eventually with the birth of the internet and that, I was involved in paranormal radio over the internet and did some podcasts, some very early podcasts back in the mid 90s. And there was another guy named Lou Gentili. Lou Gentili was going to do a show on Amityville, and I told George about it. And I said, hey, there's going to be an Amityville show. He listened in and actually called in that night. And that began George kind of stepping out for the first time in so many years and talking about Amityville again. Those were kind of the first little forays, those conversations that he had with Lou. But George and I began meeting. We would talk over the phone. We eventually started going to conventions together, Penn State. We went to several in North Carolina together, and we would talk about violent hauntings. And George was very kind and patient in working with my family and explaining how this stuff works and what's going on with these violent hauntings in particular. And he gave me a lot of information on how to alleviate some of that stuff. And, you know, I am a paranormal investigator. I go out and I work with families who are afraid to sleep in their own house at night. And I use a lot of the information that I garnered from the Lutzes, all of them, Chris, Danny, George, Kathy, Ed and Lorraine, all of that. We began to start to compile some of that. And we found that there were ways and methods to go through and alleviate some of the stuff that was going on in people's homes.
All right. You become friends with this guy. Obviously, you know from following through that there's a lot of controversy surrounding the Lutz family, and many people are crying hoax. I know you're an intelligent guy. We've known each other for a long time. I know that you're cautious with who you talk to and what info you give out. When he is telling you this, how much of you is laying on the skeptical side of his claims, and how much of you is buying into his story?
Originally, when we first started talking about this stuff, he was more concerned about what was happening in my home than the Amityville thing. We actually didn't bring that up for quite a long time in our friendship. Eventually, once he started stepping out again and talking about what had happened to him and his family there, I said, George, I'm going to take 5 years. And I'm going to investigate this. And I've talked, everybody that's on the screen right now, we all know each other. And behind the scenes, we've talked about this stuff and compared notes. And there were times when George would tell me, no, that's an exaggeration. No, that's something Jay wrote in the book. And he was perfectly honest with stuff. And then there were times when he would talk about things like the last night in the house. And you would have a connection with him where you could look in his eyes, you could see his body language, and I knew him very well. And I just felt in my heart that he was telling the truth because, you know, I had gone through some of the same things. There were a lot of commonalities there.
In all retrospect now, Tim, having years away from George since his passing and being able to look at his story, do you believe that it was the parts that you felt were truthful truly were, or did he just tell himself those stories so many times that he believed his own version of the story?
Well, even back at the time that this thing occurred and the movie came out, and it was the big event that it was, you have to remember that George and Kathy, in an effort to try to tell what happened truthfully and without exaggeration, because we know that there was some creative license that happened in the book and especially in the movie, they went to one of the top polygraph experts in the country. And he was the guy that had taught polygraph for the FBI Academy. His name's not coming to me right now. I almost want to say Chris Gugas, but and Blade they had passed.
Yeah.
And he was a guy who had developed the method for doing polygraph for the FBI. They went in, they passed the test, and there's a wonderful photo out there of Chris Gugas holding the results and looking at George like, oh my gosh, he's telling the truth. And both him and Kathy were asked several questions about the haunting, and they passed it, hands down. And I can't say for sure that everything that George told me was the truth, because, there's so many people who are involved in this story. But I think that at the end of the day, they definitely had an experience in the house. It was very frightening. It was very violent. And that there are a lot of people who, in an attempt to tell the story, Jay Anson, the movie folks that created the movie, in trying to tell it, there was some exaggeration. There was some creative license. Obviously, all of us here have done television that's on this screen, and we all know that they don't always get it quite right. It doesn't translate well onto video or onto a book type circumstance. But the things that I asked him, and a lot of the material.
Let me address that real quickly, just so you know, folks, having worked and been friends with the family that was involved in the haunting in Connecticut, Carmen Snedeker, having been friends with Christopher Lutz, Christopher Quarantino, having been friends with Andrea Perrin from the Conjuring story, being friends with so many of these famous, the Smurl haunting that was also a famous Ed Lorraine case. All of them will tell you that when you sign a movie contract to tell your story, everybody goes into it with the hopes their story is going to come out. And Hollywood cannot stop themselves from twisting. And in some cases, the real elements are much more terrifying than a floating pig outside the window, right? There are some chilling aspects to the story that get left on the cutting room floor, and blood starts pouring through the walls and mass amounts of flies appear in a room. And that's the Hollywood's way of indicating we need something to show decay and festering. So let's make it, there were, I think Christopher said, there were flies, but there were 10 or 12 flies. The movie's got, I think it was Rod Steiger, if I remember correctly, swatting away at hundreds of flies coming at him. So there's a lot of creative license. So it's easy to attack the Lutzes for this, but in all reality, when you put yourself out to tell your story, it no longer becomes your story. It becomes the kind of public domain, sadly, and they get to do with it what they want. Now, we've heard George and Kathy Lutz's stories through the years. There was a silent majority up until the early 2000s that didn't have a voice, and that is the Lutz children. And George was not their biological father. He was the stepfather, but they took on his last name. There were three of them, Missy, Daniel, and Christopher. And Daniel was the first to kind of come forward in the public in the way that he was given a voice. And that will lead us into our next guest. Joining us now, Eric Walter is the director and producer of the documentary, My Amityville Horror. And we will have a link for that on today's program so that you can find this documentary and take a look at it. This was giving voice to one of the children in this series. And it was much different than a lot of what we had grown to know and understand. Eric, thank you so much for joining us today.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you.
When you start to dig into this case, you kind of go in with one narrative in mind. And then you start to hear Danny's story. And I know you've talked to Christopher and Missy elected not to go into these parts of her history. How blown away were you with how their story broke off from what we've been told for 40 years?
Well, it's a unique position to be in, of being someone who, of course, was not around at the time these events actually took place. And so I'm coming into it in a third party perspective and only learning what I'm researching, talking to people like everyone here tonight, and just hearing, relationships with like Laura DiDio and hearing her firsthand account of, having investigated the house and being there first person. And so there was this kind of, I just felt like this were the children ever going to be able to come forward, or would they ever have the opportunity to do that? I know Christopher had kind of gone, he had never come out, and still has never come out and fully told his story 110% of it. But he had kind of come out in various ways before even Danny had spoken publicly with his story online in different outfits. But funny enough, Blaine and myself had actually developed a website which was entitled AmityvilleFiles.com, and where we had just put together a massive amount of research and documentation on the case. And it was just essentially a passion for myself and for Blaine. And one thing led to another. And after a few years of compiling this information, we were contacted out of the blue by someone who knew Daniel Lutz, and that, Danny wants to come forward and tell his story. Initially, I was very skeptical that it was even him. There's, if anybody knows, this story attracts a lot of crazy characters. So, we were very cautious about it, looking at it. And but once I was sent a picture of him, the likeness was so striking to Kathy that knew immediately that this was legit. And to make a very long story short, flew to New York and met with him. And to answer your question, I got into it interested in, yes, what I had researched and been, heard George and Kathy's story a million times. And there was this connection with a lot of the work that Tim had done, even interviewing, on Lou Gentili's show, and hearing the Penn State University. I used to absorb these long lectures George would give, and would knew, there was a consistency too. If you listen to his interviews, there is this essential, there's a connectivity to everything he was talking about. So I had essentially memorized all this, knew all of this going in. So, but nothing prepared me for what this became. And it became very apparent for anybody that's seen the documentary that this was not going to be a film about trying to set the record straight. This was very much a film about, in my opinion, the psychological effects that this had on someone. And to me, I'll say at the end of the day, I don't view the documentary as something as like, this is going to convince you that this happened. But to me, I think that there is more evidence that something traumatic did happen. Tim, you talked about looking into George's eyes and seeing that reaction. I had those same experiences with Daniel, and I know that while I'm very skeptical about various aspects of his story, I do feel that there was a sincerity in something very real that did happen to this family, and that there was something very dark in that house that affected all of them.
And we'll dig into that a little bit later. Having been friends with Christopher for a number of years, Eric, you talking extensively with Daniel, we'll talk about some of those aspects of the story. But I want to go back to Dr. Holzer's involvement in this case. And again, Alex, he was a fan of getting history right and understanding it. Not just that there's ghosts or that the Lutz family was chased out, but
right.
And even overlooking what would have been the obvious, the DeFeo family. Oh, if there's ghosts, it's got to be the DeFeo family. These were tragic murders that took place in this house. But none of the Lutz family ever seemed to really talk about the DeFeo family as being the ones that were haunting them. And is that how you remember your father hearing it? It wasn't really about the DeFeos at all.
No, I mean, there was a disturbance going on. Like any other case, he would be contacted or he would read about it, but it was usually back then through referrals. So yeah, we didn't have internet back then, everything was done, you pick up the phone, you make a call, And so when he decided to go out and do that, one of the first things was he wanted to meet with the town mayor. He wanted to meet with the town's librarian. He wanted to get information, not just walk into the house with a medium in tow and say, what do you got? Everything has to correlate. And so he was so fascinated with the parcel because he couldn't understand what was going on. And when Ethel went into her trance and she picked up on an Indian chief spirit that was very angry because he had been desecrated, their people have been desecrated. And that's what came out. It's not that she understood why it came out. That's what came through to her sitting in the house, which was emptied at the time. So, you've got that. And then you've got the other side of it where my father's interviewing all sorts of people, that were related to the story and the case and so forth. and he did it with respect. And he found out that, you know, the land itself was the problem. This is going back into like the late 1700s, early 1800s. Farmland. Where we live here in New York, an hour from Manhattan, it's farmland. You know, New York is, you know, we know this very well. And so it was just all farmland, and there was a couple of barns, and the story goes that he was told was a couple of kids were playing around and running on the field as kids do, and especially back then. What is there to do? I guess you burn hay. I don't know what you do back then. But the point was that they had, you know, this land to work with. And there was something in the barn that the kids were afraid to go towards, that it was ominous or something. And so one day the barn had burnt down. Nobody knew why. And there was a whole, you know, thing with the property, and they couldn't use it and stuff. So my father had said that his belief was that the parcel itself already had harbored negative energy, if you will. Call it what you want, but something that is not a place that you would want to build on. And there are places like that in this world. So the other part of it was that he was told that they had moved that 112 Ocean Avenue, that house was on another parcel originally, and that they had moved the houses. Now, do you remember driving and seeing houses on those trailers driving by? And it's like when I was a kid in Manhattan coming home from Long Island, and I'm seeing this like mini house go by, I'm like, what the heck is that? It's real. They did that. So he said that they potentially had moved the house and put it on that parcel when they were developing the area. I don't know if this is true or not. I'm just, you know, so maybe it was the story. Okay. Well, that's very cool. I don't know. This I'm trying to from memory. You know, this is something from when I was a kid when I started learning about it. So and so it wasn't even the original house. Like the whole thing was like put together like a puzzle. So here's the land. Here comes the house that already had a home, another parcel. Poof, there it goes, on property that already inhabited a lot of stuff. Now, what could that be? Could it be, you know, the chief came through saying, you're sitting on our people and you're playing with like our bones and stuff? Not cool.
Right.
So,
well, and just so people know, I mean, the concept of ancient Indian burial grounds has become kind of a standing joke when it comes to a haunting. Oh, was it old ancient Indian burial grounds? Well, on the East Coast, yeah, a lot of those areas and mounds were places where they would bury their dead, and they were treated horribly by the early settlers and by the British that came over to settle, and wiped out in many of these cases, and bodies discarded. And your father really dug deep into the concept that the psychic scarring is what had touched the land. Laura, I want to know, when you came with, was Dr. Holzer there before the Warrens had come to investigate?
No, actually, and I can fill in some pieces to the puzzle for you, Alexandra. Please. When the Lutzes had that first press conference in late January with William Weber, who was the defense attorney that represented Ronnie in his murder trial, we wanted to go out at Channel 5 and get into the house. And I had been able to contact the Lutzes, told them that I knew people who could help them. And I had done several interviews with Hans before that. So the first person that I called, I was the one who called your dad and asked him to go out and investigate. Now, the backstory on this is that Hans wanted to do it right as a documentarian. But Channel 5 News at that time, an independent news organization with a shoestring budget, the news division is separate from the entertainment division. So Hans justifiably wanted to be paid. And the backstory on this, let's go back even a little further without digressing too much, was that back in 1968 or 69, Hans had actually done an hour-long documentary for Channel 5 on the Cafe Bazaar, which was a discotheque at the height of the hippie movement. It was Aaron Burr's old house and stables in the West Village. And it was and he had gone in with Sybil Leek. And it was one of the highest rated documentaries at the time. So he was envisioning doing something like that. At that time, when I called him, the Amityville story, again, this is with, you know, pre-internet days, pre-Google, pre-Facebook, Instagram, Snapchat. That little story that was picked up in some of the newspapers hadn't really gotten a lot of play in Manhattan from Suffolk County to Manhattan. And we talked to Hans about it. And we said, well, we can't pay you. We don't have the money. And Steve Bauman, who was the Emmy Award-winning, preeminent, muckraking investigative journalist at Channel 5 at the time, got on the phone and pleaded with him. And Hans said, well, no, if we're not going to do this right, I'm not going to do it at all. So it was only at that point, then I called the Warrens and asked them to come and do it. Fast forward a bit, and I was actually, Hans called me up a few months later in late 1976 because he wanted to go out into the house. At that point, the Lutzes had given it back to the bank. And as Alexandra said, the house was empty. I had already done a lot of research on the property. And you had the Monhegan tribe and the Shinnecock Indians. And as you correctly pointed out, Dave, the Indians were all over. Native Americans were all over Long Island. I grew up on the North Shore of Long Island in Queens. And my town of College Point was right on the water, and they uncovered lots of Indian burial grounds there. But it's not like you see it in the movies,
right?
Like Jeremiah Johnson. And there weren't even headstones, okay? But there is no doubt, and we came upon that research very early on, before we even put the story on the air at Channel 5. And there was all the history of that being an Indian burial ground. And when I went back to the Amityville Historical Society a week later, the information had disappeared out of the library. I told that to Eric Walter. And ironically, just in the past couple of years, and I said, look, I had that info. It was there. I saw it. Disappeared. And then you can go back into the archives now. And Eric posted something on social media where we saw the articles from 1895. 1800 saying, just like you showed these little snippets from the newspapers at the time, that there was in fact an Indian burial ground, that people on Ocean Avenue and that people who were building unearthed the skeletons of 4 Native Americans. So again, yes, it was there. And if you start disrupting things, and by the way, during that seance, the house was empty with Hans and Ethel Johnson Myers. It was January 12th. The house was 1977. The house was completely empty. It was not a particularly cold day, although the heat had not been on in the house. So but it wasn't 15 degrees in the house. And Hans's camera froze up. And he says, that's funny. That never happened before. But when Ethel Johnson Myers went into the trance, and that was something to behold, because at that time she was in her 70s, and she was a trained opera singer, by the way. But when she went into the trance, and when her spirit guide, who was her deceased husband, Albert, came through and was guiding her, then the next thing you know, we heard the spirit of a teenage Native American boy who said he was very angry because kids had found, kids years later had found his skull and were playing, soccer with it. Oh. And he was upset. But if you could have seen Ethel, her voice, the physical transformation when she went into that deep trance was astounding, because her voice dropped several octaves. And obviously, as a trained opera singer, she might have been able to manipulate her voice, but she was well into her 70s at that point. And she developed this huge Adam's apple that she didn't have. And she also was speaking, and if anybody has ever heard Native Americans speak, true Native Americans on Western shows or what have you, you know that their accent is very, very difficult to duplicate. So that teenage Native American boy who came through really had the cadence and the language, etc. So Hans always said to me he thought it was a simple haunting. That said, everyone who was in there who had an opinion, as everyone does, had a different take on it.
Right.
The Warrens thought it was a demonic force from deep in the bowels of the earth and not a haunting. Ironically, nobody who's been in there who ascribes to the theory that this is a true haunting or possession or malevolent force, whatever, has really ever come out and said it's the ghost of the dead DeFeos, the murdered DeFeos doing this, which I've always found particularly fascinating.
Well, and we're going to cover that with one slight addendum in a little bit. So if you guys know what I'm alluding to, hold off on that, and I've got the picture and I want to get into that aspect of it. Part of the part that I love doing on Holzer Files is reviewing some of the notes from other people and watching them tear Hans Holzer apart, calling him a charlatan, a fake, and a fraud, how he got this wrong and that wrong. And now here we are in 2019, 2020, doing the Holzer Files, 2021, filming this series. And now we're finding that he was right. Many things are buried, as Laura just mentioned. Suddenly, all of these records vanish, and it isn't until now, when people forgot that those original scans are still out there, that it can be corroborated. But what I love is listening to Hans Holzer's voice in both his handwritten and vocalization, talking about these aspects and not backing down. We're going to go to break in a moment. Before we do that, I want to give you guys a little taste. This is an actual news segment with Dr. Holzer talking about Amityville. You can hear the dismissive nature, in a sense, from the reporter. And I love the way Holzer steps up and shuts this guy down with, no, let's not turn this into something else. This is what I said. This is what I mean. So let's take a look at that. We'll come back. We'll take a break, and we'll continue on with the show. So let me pull this up. I love this piece. Hold on one second.
I know.
The Amityville murders spawned a cottage industry of demonic tales. There have been 7 movies and 8 books, 2 of them written of parapsychology. Dr. Holzer is a prolific author who has written more than 100 books, including his latest, Psychic, True Paranormal Experiences. Dr. Holzer, thank you so much for joining us. You watched that report with great interest, and you were shaking your head quite frequently.
Oh, well,
you refute a lot of the things that were said in that report?
Well, I guess it's not actually a horror story. It's just a horrible story, because I always like fiction and nonfiction separate. So what I've seen here, of course, I've heard before. What is interesting to me is that the real cause of all this hullabaloo has not been mentioned by any of them, because they're not aware of it. Now, the house in question stands on an ancient Indian cemetery, and desecrating Indian cemeteries in other places has proven to be not a very good proposition. I don't know how you feel about life after death. I feel there is a continuance of existence in another dimension, shall we say. It has nothing to do with religion or beliefs or disbeliefs or the supernatural. There is another side to life, which we call the other side of life, and part of us, the inner self, proceeds into that world. Now, what we have here is not a house of horror. We do not have demons, because there are no such things as demons or devils. That's a fantasy that religious fanatics like to dream up. We have a couple in question here. And as far as Mr. Lutz is concerned, whatever he experienced may have been just ordinary poltergeist phenomena. That is to say, noises and so on.
Okay, a lot of us remain skeptical. Here you are, you have studied the house in Amityville, and you have written over about 112 books now on this subject. Yeah. What can you tell us? Talk to us about this mound, this Indian burial ground that you talk about.
I have been to the house more than anybody else. I was there for the first time with the famous deep trance medium Ethel Myers, and we had an Indian come through her, an Indian chief, and on further investigation, I discovered that the house was built on Indian burial ground. That
it was a shell mound. That was where they held prisoners. There were the Manasquan and the Shinnecock Indians had lived at that,
particularly,
in that region.
It so happened that I found out further that in 1905, a skeleton was partially washed out by a rainstorm, and this skeleton had the skull of the skeleton was broken off by a young fellow, a child, And from that moment on, phenomena started to happen in the house.
Now, explain, if you will, Dr. Holzer, how is the fact that there was a cemetery that you say existed there, how would that create these strange occurrences?
Because, again, you may feel otherwise about life after that and continuous of existence, but assuming that there is, and I know from the evidence I have accumulated over 30 years, the Indian chief, whose skeleton was being desecrated, wasn't amused by it. And if you're somebody knocked off your block, you wouldn't particularly like it either. And apparently somebody did, played football with it, and that aroused the Indian to a warpath against anybody living in the house. That's when the fun started. There was another house on that spot.
Let me quote, please, from William Lauder. He's the director of the Amityville Historical Society, directly on your point about a burial ground. It's totally nonsense, he says. There was no cemetery or sacred ground there. It is a shame to prolong and keep this myth going. It's only for monetary gain. Anyone who believes it is a victim. It's a shameful intrusion upon reason and totally devoid of any foundation in fact.
Well, that's also not true, because I have that information from the chief librarian of Amityville, who researched it for me, and this is on tape because we made a documentary in 1977, in which he appears, where he clearly states that there was, in fact, an Indian burial ground on that stuff. Now, this comes from the librarian of Amityville, and it is on the record. So whatever you read to me is just not true.
But there are reasonable people out there who look at this, they read it. There are some people who want to believe it, and there are others who say, show me evidence that it's true. What evidence do you provide, Dr. Holzer, that this is true, that you're saying that there are forces of people who lived at another time, who were buried in a ground there, who are behind these forces and the supernatural occurrences?
Don't misquote me, please. I didn't say anything like that.
I'm trying to interpret.
You be very careful.
Try to understand.
Yeah, no, I didn't say anything of the sort. I said that the librarian of Amityville went to great extent. At first, he didn't like to talk about
prior to that, you were saying that because it was a burial ground, that is what is bringing out these forces, this overpowering force that is creating these problems.
Now,
Did I misinterpret that?
Don't write another fiction book.
Then please clarify.
It's very simple. Before 1905, there was another house on that spot, which was built in 1782. See, I do my research very carefully. I don't make it up. And that house was perfectly calm until in 1905. Then suddenly, in the other house, phenomena started to occur of such a kind. People moved in and out. Somebody committed suicide. They moved the house to another spot in Amityville, and it still exists there, and nothing ever happened to that 1782 house again. Instead, there was an empty lot. On that empty lot, in 1928, a new house was built, the one that is still there. This house was built and was then inhabited by the DeFeo family. The DeFeos started having problems with it, of what we call poltergeist phenomena, footsteps and objects moving, that sort of thing. Among the DeFeos was a young man who was a natural medium. That happens. People are born that way with a sixth sense.
Getting back into it, it goes on for a few more minutes, and you can find that online, of course. It's like I said, I love that Dr. Holzer steps up and corrects him. And he was going off the information that would be given to him at the time from the people involved in these stories. He stood up. It's now being proven. Eric, you had told me off air that you did, and as Laura brought up, you had uncovered these articles, right? That they do exist, proving that there were Indian burial grounds on the sites, and that a lot of what he was telling is a very plausible part of the history.
Yeah, there was documentation. I mean, I don't know if it proves it, but there was documentation that there definitely were bones unearthed on Ocean Avenue, on properties near the water. And I actually have posted, I know on my Twitter feed, there's and I believe I sent it to you, Dave, as well. There was a map as well of a property that was close to 112, to the same lot that the house is located on. And so, the being afforded now the luxury of newspapers.com and archives like that we can go and search for these things. It's interesting, as Laura pointed out, that these, the archives would suddenly disappear when they weren't accessible online. So, there definitely was, I don't want to sound conspiratorial, but there was an effort to conceal details that Holzer had discovered, that Laura had discovered. And Amityville, the town, I think it had more to do with, they absolutely they wanted nothing to do with this. They didn't want anything that spoke to the truth about this, being that there was any validity to the haunting in any way, shape, or form. And so when the book came out and the movie, and it's never stopped since. It's been a complete circus.
Let's take a quick break. We'll come back. We've got more to discuss. You're listening to the best in paranormal talk radio. This is Darkness Radio presents Holzer's Ghosts. Welcome back to the program. Thank you very much for tuning in. Tonight we're talking about Amityville. Why is there still such a fascination with this? There's a new documentary called A Shock Doc that can be found on Discovery Plus, and you will see, I think, 4 of my 5 guests on that Shock Doc. It's Amityville, the House of Horror, I believe, Horror House. I'm sorry, Amityville Horror House. It's on there. It's a really great documentary you can check out for yourself. Eric Walter is also the director and producer of another documentary, standalone documentary called My Amityville Horror, where we go into the life of Daniel Lutz and talk about his perspective of the haunting. I want a quick, if I could, just a quick 1-2 word answer from each one of you. And I'll call you out. Do you believe the house was haunted, or the family was haunted, or there was no haunting? Alexandra?
I think the area was haunted, and whatever was going to be put there was going to either have an effect to it or not, because it's the same thing in life. If you're aware and awake, you're going to tap into something. If you're just blindfolded walking through life, you're not going to pay attention to it unless something's like hitting you in the head. I know that's like more than 1 or 2 words. I think it's a common look. The parcel is freaking got some major issues, and whatever's on there is going to emulate. And like when my father believed, if you've got a very sensitive being in that environment, they could be taken over, potentially, according to what many people believe is possession. So that's what I feel.
Psychically scarred terrain.
I like that term. Absolutely.
Laura, what do you think? Was the location haunted, or were the people haunted?
I think both, to a certain extent. And then I also think you cannot discount the living aspect of it, because in truth, that parcel is now more haunted by thrill seekers and people who have turned it into a cult and who are imposing their own narrative on it. So while many things have been exaggerated, when you get down to the nub of it, there is always, where there's smoke, there's fire. But it's finding that grain of truth, and not everybody is going to have the same truth.
Tim Yancey, is the property haunted, the family haunted, or was it a hoax? We've got a bit of a delay going for Tim.
Am I here?
Yeah. Can you hear me, Tim?
I'm sorry. Okay. I think that absolutely that the land clearly had negative energy on it, and that's going to stay there until something else comes along to displace it. I believe that Hans Holzer was right on. George Lutz told me the very same thing, that several of our guests here have said that.
Oof. We're fighting the bugaboo of bad connectivity with poor Tim Yancey. We'll go to you, Eric Walter. What do you make of it after having had a chance to do this documentary, a deep dive, and work on your own documentary and on the Shock Doc?
Perfect storm.
We're catching bits of Yancey, but go ahead, Eric.
I hate to cheat and say both as well, but I meaning the family and the house, but I definitely try to remain as being a documentary filmmaker in the objective lane as much as possible. But I'm not scared to admit it. I do think that there was legitimacy to the haunting, and that there were aspects of it that were true. But I think this case has snowballed into such a fantastical extravaganza of the paranormal that now these stories that are being repeated that are coming out even within Daniel Lutz's own account. We're hearing movie versions of the flies, attacking the priest and things like this that George and Kathy, if you know their testimony, never claimed happened. Whether, it's not my place to say that that's intentional, or it may be on his part to try to make it more dramatic, but it also could be, as my film goes into, the child trying to, this is the way he remembers this. This was imprinted on his memory. Right. So to answer your question, I do think that the family themselves, they certainly have been haunted by what they went through, and that they have lived with this and in the shadow of this. And my film definitely tried to highlight the kind of black sheep of the family, as it will, which was Daniel Lutz, who was kind of the antithesis to George's perspective. George, of course, was out there as kind of the main voice of the story for until 2006, until he passed. And then the children started to come forward to talk. And so, there definitely is a lot of bad blood there, obviously, for anyone who's seen the film. And I think that definitely colors a lot of Daniel's statements about what happened. But, I know that Laura, I don't want to, it'd be an interesting question to hear from you too, but I think a lot of what happened there, that George was a catalyst for a lot of the activity that was going on for the family.
Blaine, was the property haunted, the family haunted, or was there a hoax?
My personal belief is that the family was haunted, much like what Eric just said. I think there were some things that were going on there that never came out while George was alive and while he was living. But we can't forget about the fact that 6 people ultimately were killed here. So right. There's the opportunity for that psychic energy to potentially hang in that house. And but my belief is truly that the family themselves were haunted, and that what occurred to them during those 28 days followed them out of that house. And the family themselves reported that they continued to experience haunting activity after they left the Amityville house. So I think that, combined with some of the stories that have come out over the years about potential occult activity taking place in that house, it seems to point out more and more that there could have been a lot more to this story, a lot more to what was actually going on in that house during the 28 days, maybe than we actually knew.
I don't want to speak for Christopher in depth because he's not here and it's his story to tell. But for those of you that have been to live events with us, and we've done panels, the two of us, where I moderate and walk him through, he talks about the fact that he believes that the haunting began because of George. Because George already had a fascination with the paranormal and the occult. And there have been many people that have come forward, even some of George's friends, that have gone on record saying that he was visiting occult bookstores and doing things before they bought this house. And that there's thoughts that maybe he was already putting this in play. I know the boys believe that George was somehow calling these energies in through a form of transcendental meditation and a mixture of illegal drugs, and they think that's why it got so bad. There's so much more to the story that we'll leave to Eric's very fine documentary and for Chris to come forward and tell in the future. But it does appear that the haunting was centered around the family because of the dysfunction. And we hear, and your dad talked about it, Dr. Barry Taff, Dr. William Roll, so many other paranormal investigators that have discussed the poltergeist phenomena, and it usually centers around dysfunctional families and children that are prepubescent or just bursting into that frame. And you have so much of that with the DeFeo family that could have been feeding energy, if that's what you believe. Then the Lutz family, and the knowing that you buy this house, you're getting it for a hell of a deal. I think it was like $80,000, which is ridiculous at that time for this beautiful Dutch colonial home. They get this house, but they know what happened there. Does that start to feed the brain and then feed the anxiety? And then every little, tree brush against the wall is a demon trying to claw its way in. And, every rat skittering through the wall is something else. And does it start to play in? And then when you've got a guy who might be a little off center because of narcotics or alcohol, that starts to impact this haunting, and it becomes more of a like a very violent poltergeist type of haunting. Blaine, you brought up a great point, which Christopher has always mentioned. You know, he really took offense with the last Ryan Reynolds Amityville movie, because they took such creative license and then turned the DeFeo children into kind of these dark demonic forces, forgetting that they're not characters in a novel. They're real people that were brutally murdered in their sleep. Talk to me about that aspect, if you would, Blaine, because I want people they have to keep that in mind.
Yeah, I think ultimately that is one of the things that a lot of people tend to forget with this case, is that there were 6 people that were murdered inside this house. And, you know, going back to why the town of Amityville has chosen to ignore this story or try to sweep it under the rug as much as possible, you know, you got to remember that there are still people who live in that town who grew up with these kids. There are still people who knew the DeFeos very, very well. These were their friends. So there is that real part of that story that no matter how you look at the Amityville haunting, whether you believe it was a hoax, whether you believe that it was real, there were 6 people that were murdered inside of that house. And that is something that's often overlooked. Hollywood has taken advantage of that in several of the movies. And that is really the tragedy of this story, is that the DeFeos themselves have really ultimately paid the price for the horror story as we've come to know it.
Christopher and I actually, a number of years ago, we were out in New York doing a conference, and he said, today is visiting day at the prison. I want to go. Would you come with me? And we drove 2.5 hours out to the prison and got there and found out that Butch had just changed his day to an alternate day every week. So we were off by, I think, a day for the visit, and we had to fly back the next morning. So there was not that connection. There was not that chance for him to sit down and get that. And I think that's always going to nag at him, that he wasn't able to get a little bit of closure from Butch DeFeo. Laura, people are, why would Amityville hide this? Why would they keep this quiet? What kind of circus did Amityville turn into when the movie exploded? The story was all over the news. What was it like there?
Well, it was even before that. I mean, I can't explain the phenomenon of why this particular quote unquote haunted house story took off the way it did. But I can tell you, from the minute we did at Channel 5 that first piece, the phone started ringing, and I got me, the lowly news assistant, news writer, got all the calls. I actually had people calling me, kids, saying, hey, can we come out there and spend the night in the house, as if I had any say in anything. But the Amityville Police Department, okay, they were kept busy working overtime, chasing people. People were coming up the river, or it's more of a creek in back of the house, in boats, trying to break in.
Stealing pieces of the house, parts of the yard.
Yeah, well, even worse than that, urinating on the front lawn just to say, like, dare it, and you can imagine and people were coming up. You had tour buses filled with people coming up, disgorging all these people to just look at the house, take pictures, have their picture taken in front of it. And then, they moved over to St. Charles Cemetery, where the DeFeos are buried. They leave things there. So it's a pain in the neck for them. And actually, I recall when we were filming the Amityville Horror documentary, we let the Amityville police know, and they said, okay, just get in and out quickly. But as quick as you tried to be, as Tim Yancey and Blaine all said, the minute you get in front of that house and you see people peeping out in front of the blinds, from behind the blinds. But as we were filming really quickly and being as discreet as possible, every car that drove by would honk their horns to try and interrupt the shoot or disrupt things. So it's a pain in the neck for the town. It is literally at this point haunted by the living.
Well, we have a lot of people that want to know why hasn't the Holzer files gone to this house in Amityville to prove once and for all that it was just the Lutz family that was haunted, or so on. Well, I work for Ghost Adventures. I know that between Ghost Adventures production and the network, we were throwing some heavy duty money at the owners of the Amityville house. And correct me, gentlemen, ladies, if you know better than this, my understanding was when you purchase that house, you basically are also in an agreement that you will not make it a bed and breakfast. You won't turn it into a tourist trap or a museum or a gift shop, and you won't allow filming. Is that true? Eric, let's start with you with your documentary.
I don't know the exact answer to that, to be honest with you, but all I know is that it's definitely been, that's my suspicion, is that there's some sort of trust with the people who live there, that there's, I don't want to suggest that there's some sort of secret contract or, you know, something that we will not allow the media in, but you can't help but wonder if that is somewhat the case, because certainly anyone that moves in there, there has to be a heavy screening process of anyone that's allowed in or certainly to move into the property.
Right. I do know that when the house was up for sale a few years back, I knew a couple of very wealthy paranormal enthusiasts that were attempting to buy the house and were told they were not allowed to buy the house because research was done on them and they were ghost hunters. So they weren't allowed to purchase the home. Blaine, what do you know about the rights of being able to film in the Amityville house, or is my understanding correct?
Yeah, again, I'm kind of in the same position that Eric's in. I'm not entirely sure exactly what that looks like behind the scenes, what sort of agreements take place. What I can tell you is, and I don't want to jump too far ahead in the story, but when I was in the house back in 2017 and I was talking with the previous owner, she had told me that there was actually an attempt to buy the house by a production studio, and that it had gone very, very, very close to actually happening. But she sort of chuckled to herself because she said there was no way that they would ever actually be able to film there, and that there was some sort of lockdown that they wouldn't actually be able to do that. So I don't know the ins and outs, the exact details of what transpired there, but I do recall her telling me that story, that somebody in fact did try to purchase the house specifically to use it for filming purposes.
Laura, you were there for the heat of it. You were there in the midst of it when you could get in and out and film crews came and went. Mm-hmm. Do you remember when the spigot got turned off?
I don't think that there was that. Well, I think what happened was it reached a peak right after the movie, and then the Cromarties bought it right after the DeFeos. And there was such litigation. Everybody was suing everybody over the past 45 years over this thing. And the Cromarties were in People magazine, and they were posed in the thing, and they said, hey, in the red room, there's nothing here, etc. So, but I think it's incorrect. The town certainly would not allow it to be turned into a for-profit, a haunted attraction, which, by the way, was William Weber's idea with the Lutzes. And they played me the tape.
Wow.
Of that. He had great ideas back in 1976. We'll put the house in a trust. We will turn it into an attraction. We can get at least 2 or 3 books and several movies out of this. So this was marketing 101. But I do recall, and Blaine is talking about the former owners, and I know who he's talking about. They actually were longtime residents of Amityville, and worked at the Amityville Historical Society. They were allowed to, any of the owners could allow somebody in the house to film. That's not the problem, but you can't turn it into a for-profit business. And by the way, just as an aside, one of those former owners I spoke to on the phone and was telling me, oh, this is just as the New York Times said. It's a tired old ghost story, and it's totally not true. But the minute, and Eric knows this, the minute I mentioned Danny Lutz's name, this seemingly upstanding citizen went ballistic and just started spewing a stream of foul imprecations. Blah, 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 blah. George, And Danny Lutz, I would never let, and George had passed away by that time. She says, those are the people who brought the darkness into this house. I would never let Danny in here. He could bring the darkness back. So from just 5 minutes earlier, when I was being told it was, from her perspective, it was a tired old ghost story. It was like watching, flipping a switch and saying, darkness in the house. So it's like
Can I tell a quick story too, just very briefly? When we were
no, Eric, we don't want to hear any stories. Yeah,
You're
please.
Right. Shut up. No, I sorry to butt in here, but it should be told. I don't know if I've ever publicly even told this story, but Blaine and Laura certainly know it. But when we were filming in front of the house, and we had to be clear permits to shoot there, one of the former owners, we were out there with a pretty massive cinema camera, and we're shooting just a shot in front of the street. In fact, it's the opening, one of the opening shots of the documentary where Danny steps in front of the house and lights up a cigarette, and he's just standing there smoking a cigarette in front of the house. And we were on the sidewalk. We were not on the property, not touching a blade of grass. And the owner came out and got in our face, essentially, was livid. You talk about people passing and yelling curse words. Well, this guy was, he was very unhappy. I actually have footage of this, by the way, of this going on. And Danny, of course, is not one to put up with any sort of, anytime there's instant, right? He's there, man. He's there. He's ready. So I'm standing in between, at the time, the current owner of the house, and Danny Lutz, who's like ready to go into a fist fight with this guy. Thank God it didn't happen, but it was, at that point I was thinking, I've gotten a little too close to this story, I think, that it was going down.
I did get a message from Tim Yancey. He says, sorry, everybody. This started right before showtime. I never have problems with my internet. Maybe it's the Amityville curse. Sorry if it created a problem. For folks, if you want to hear his take on the Amityville case, we do have it in our archives, so you can go to Darkness Radio and listen to it on Stitcher. Go back. I think it's in season 2 or 3. And it's quite detailed there, so you can get a lot more from Tim Yancey. Let's talk real quickly, if you don't mind, about some of the things. Kathy's nightmares, the black ooze that was coming out, which I think in the movie they transferred into blood dripping. The shadow people and inhuman figures. That is consistent, it appears, that even though Danny and Christopher do not back a lot of George's stories and his claims of some of these deals, the shadow people and the inhuman figures are something that it seems everybody in the family is in agreement of. Then there's Missy's invisible friend. And I believe, talking to Christopher, he's always said, hey, a lot of people have invisible playmates. And yeah, she'd talk and something would respond from time to time. But he said this flying pig outside the window, I don't even know where that came up from. What can you guys each talk to me about with that aspect, Laura, with the activity? When you were there at the house, did anything weird ever happen for you to corroborate any of these stories?
Well, I didn't see any shadow people. And of course, the seance was going on. And what did happen was, during the seance, several of the psychics who were there, one got sick, another one ran screaming out of the room saying it's on the second floor. It's on the second floor. What it was, I don't know. But two big things, and I didn't feel anything myself, but I was sitting between Marvin Scott, who was the reporter from Pix that you saw. He went on to he still works for Channel 11, and Mike Linder, who was the radio reporter from WNEW, which was the sister radio station. And at various times, within 5 or 10 minutes of each other, Marvin said to me, hey, I just felt a chill during the seance. And then 5 minutes later, Mike Linder, who was also an avowed skeptic to this day, as is Marvin Scott, said, hey, I just felt a chill. And I'm sitting between them and I didn't feel a thing. And meanwhile, you've got psychics running out saying they felt ill, etc. But for me, what clinched it was when we first got to the house that Saturday night, Steve Petropoulos, who was our stringer cameraman, and cameramen in those days, they had to be very, very fit because the equipment that they were lugging was much heavier than today.
Right.
Okay. And so he was about 40 years old, 5'9", 5'10", slim guy. And, he was covering riots and demonstrations, and you'd have to run with those cameras. He walked up the stairs to the second floor landing where there was a lot of activity that the psychics felt. And he got to the top of the stairs, and I was at the bottom on the stair landing, and he turned around, and all of a sudden I just watched the color drain out of his face, and he broke into a sweat, and he grabbed his chest and he doubled over. He was clutching his chest. So our sound guy and our lighting guy ran up, got him downstairs, put him on the bottom step, brought him some water. He was having severe heart palpitations. Now, again, at that time, Steve Petropoulos was from New Jersey. The haunting story was not a big deal at that point. So that for me was a big thing. The house was so active that night. There must have been 25, 30 people in there. It was lit from basement to attic, or third floor in this case. So Ed Warren called a halt to the proceedings around 3:30, 4 a.m. But I wanted to go back into the house on my own. I wasn't supposed to do it. I had the Lutz's house keys. So on a Saturday afternoon, a couple of weeks later, I decided to go into the house in broad daylight, and I had my German Shepherd, my dog Fritz. He was a Shepherd Lab mix, and if he were alive today, he would be one of those empath dogs that could sense things.
Right.
So I went in. I just wanted to look around, and the dog was off the leash, and I'm walking around. All of a sudden, the dog was in the front foyer, and it's a big front entryway, center hallway. And I hear the dog growling. So I walk out and I see my dog, this 125-pound shepherd, staring up at that spot on the second floor landing where everybody had issues. And his ears were pinned back, his teeth were bared, and the hackles were up from all the way down his back to his tailbone. And he's just standing stock still.
Ooh.
Okay. And he's got a fixed stare. Now this dog was, he's a city dog. He wasn't afraid. He was used to things, fireworks, people going by, heavy equipment. If it had been a person, he would have run up there. Squirrels in the attic, he would have run up there. But he was I could tell that the dog could see something that I couldn't. And that freaked me out. So I started up the stairs, and I'm not ashamed to admit I got halfway up and I said, Laura, this probably isn't a good idea. Because up until that point, I didn't feel that whatever was there or whatever was going on was at all interested in me. But I felt that if I walked up those stairs, that I would have, I would have been messing with something and gotten messed back with in return. I said, okay, time to leave. So, call me yellow and
right. No, I'm going to call you a human, but
but I got out of there. So
that leads to an interesting point. You said your cameraman had gone upstairs and got overwhelmed. Your dog was freaking out. You start going up. You start to feel something. We talked about the fact that through all these hauntings, there was never any indication that it might be one of the DeFeo children. 3 years after the investigation from Ed Lorraine Warren, as my understanding goes, one of the secretaries was going through photos. They had set up a still camera that was IR camera that was taking pictures like every 5 or 10 seconds, snapping off pictures, and they didn't notice this. So again, if it was a hoax, they would have found this picture much sooner, in my opinion. But one picture stood out. And I'm going to pull that picture up, and then I'd like you guys to each weigh in on this and tell me your thoughts. Folks, this is the photograph, the Amityville Ghost Boy. In 1976, professional photographer Gene Campbell set up a camera on the second floor landing of 112 Ocean Drive, Amityville, New York, the location of the DeFeo murders 2 years earlier. Many rolls of film were exposed, all showing nothing out of the ordinary except one frame. Is this the ghost of John Matthew DeFeo? And you can see over the top of the railing, you see somebody peering out that looks child size. When you look at the image, it looks uncannily like this little boy, but there's a weird glare as though they're wearing glasses. Now, I understand that the controversy around this comes that it also looks similar to an assistant that was there with the Warrens. Laura, you're shaking your head on this. What do you believe? Is that a picture of a ghost boy, or do you think that it was an inadvertent photograph of the assistant?
I don't know. Okay, first, my disclaimer, as an objective investigative reporter, I have to deal in facts. I was not there when the picture was discovered, or in fact, when it was developed. So I cannot state that it is, true. I can't state that it's, it's a fake. That said, a lot of people do think it was this fellow Paul Bartz, who was wearing a similar checked shirt and who had glasses or something. I don't know. It was kind of funny that it was never discovered, or that it wasn't noticed for 3 years. And then once it got out there in the public view, then suddenly it's the ghost boy photo. So everybody asks about that. And the thing is, we just don't know.
Now, looking at the size in the door frame, it does look like a child. Could it have been somebody sitting in a chair and looking around the corner? And this photograph just happened to snap that one shot? Very much. The photographs, and I've got it up here, and you could go find it online. Look up the Amityville Ghost Boy pictures, folks, and you'll see it. The photo comparison is pretty compelling to me, facial-wise, and it looks like a child's face with the same pug nose and larger lower lip. I'm not sure. Eric, have you seen this photograph? Obviously, what do you make of it?
I would be on the side of that it is Paul Bartz. That's my own feeling.
Okay.
I hate to be a downer for the believers, but people definitely react strongly to the photograph. And I know that, during the lectures that George gave, this was presented as, photographic evidence of a haunting. I just am not a believer in the photo. I think that it looks like a human figure that's kneeling down, looking around the corner. And whether that was deliberately done or on accident, we'll never know. But I think what's the more likelihood, whether it's someone there who was dressed very similar. If there wasn't anybody in the house without a plaid shirt and no one was there with, maybe then there would be more compelling evidence to like, okay, well, if this doesn't look like anybody. But since there was someone who did look very much like that, I think it's hard to refute that as being a likelihood.
Blaine, what are your thoughts on this famous photograph?
Well, I will say that it's an incredibly creepy photo. There's no question.
Right.
When you look at that, it hits you and you're like, oh my God, that's a ghost. I was fortunate enough that I actually was able to track Paul down. He sadly passed away, but I did talk to him on the phone, and I wanted to ask him that question. Hey, do you think this could have been you? And he skirted around the subject. He never truly gave me an answer, because I think he really liked the idea that this photo is sort of part of the Amityville lore. So he never truly gave me an answer of whether that. What I can tell you is that when I was in the house, I actually purposely set up my camera and I wanted to recreate that shot. I set it up in the exact same location. I went into what would have been Missy's bedroom, or Allison DeFeo's bedroom, where the ghost boy photo is, or the ghost boy is creeping around. And I took the exact same photo on my knees. Now I'm 6'4". I'm a fairly big person. I was aligned perfectly in that image as it is shown in the ghost boy photo. So, my belief is that it was Paul. And again, objectively, that's where I stand, but you can't say 100% either way.
Gentlemen, this is the best in paranormal talk radio. I want my checks back. If you're not going to agree with me that it's a damn ghost, what are you here for? No, I appreciate that weighing in. Now, Alex, when your father was there and he picked up, with Ethel, they picked up on the spirits of the Native Americans, the tribes. Did they come upon anything of the DeFeo family at all? And how do you answer this question? I know this is one that the skeptics throw out there. Ethel was from that area. She investigated with your father up and down the East Coast. How could she not have recognized that house when she went to visit it?
I don't know. It's just like with the ghost boy photo, I wasn't there, and, I have to believe that I think part of it with Ethel was, my father believed that the mediums that he worked with had to be protected in some way and disconnected. And I think when it came to the house, it's almost like a double take. What could have happened for her was it wasn't registering that this was there the whole time. It wasn't calling to her at that moment. And then all of a sudden she goes and she does this with my father, and it turns into what it turns into. I think, we walk by a lot of places throughout our life and don't realize that we have a connection to it. Where we live, where we bought our house here, an hour from Manhattan, Aaron Burr's other stables are about 30, 40 minutes from Chester, New York. And I had no idea. And when I was having a conversation on the phone with my sister, and her girlfriend was over at the apartment because they had moved in when my father was ill to take care of him. And so her friend's sitting on the couch, and I'm saying, oh my God, we just moved into this house. I'm pregnant with my second child. I'm hormonal, whatever. And we just found out that this, horse country up here. I said, we don't ride horses. What the frick are we doing? And that, Aaron Burr had a stable up here. And then I'm telling her this, a book falls on her head, and they look at it, and it's one of my father's books, and it's opening up to the chapter about Aaron Burr, talking about the Manhattan stable. Wow. So what I'm saying is the way it works, it's not like exact science, it's more of a spiritual thing. When you're meant to connect, you're going to connect, and then shit happens. So.
Well, and I think that speaks to both Ethel and to your father, because I'm sure my first thought would have been, oh my God, she's going to connect with the DeFeo children. If she knows this house, she's gonna know to, oh, stop shooting me, stop, Butch, right? You're gonna hear some kind of bullshit response coming from her, and that wasn't it. She tapped into what was available and what was demanding to be heard.
What was meant to be. And my father's role in this was to speak to the land and speak to the history and explain. That's really, what cyclical research is. It's not, everybody's so focused on a haunting or demonic possession. We seem to forget it comes from somewhere, whether we personally can bring it to an environment. Absolutely. There's a dozen different ways you can slice this pie. But for his role in that, that's where he was coming off of. He, this whole thing with DeFeo, and don't forget, he went to prison twice to interview him. And for me, it makes me so afraid for him at that time to have gone and done that. Why would you do that, Daddy? Like, why would you even want to talk to this man? Do you know what I mean? Like, it's horrific. But that's my feeling on it. This was him, his life path, his role. That's what it was. I personally, I'd go in there and I want to get my little, I don't know. We have a rifle, actually. I don't know how to shoot it, but I'd be packing. Do you know what I'm saying?
I don't think they let you bring rifles into prison. That's usually a bad sign, Alex.
No,
Well, okay. One thing, Alexandra, to clear up the mystery about what Ethel did and didn't tap into, your father Hans did not tell her where they were going that day.
No, I know. He never does that. I know. Obviously, hello. But
to your point, if it was the DeFeo kids, but they don't seem to be prominent in terms. At least I would have expected Big Ronnie to show up and be stomping around and do some haunting.
Right. Yeah, you would have expected something. Now, Laura, you were one of the first people allowed in there to kind of cover this case, and you covered it and were a part of this. What was the news like at that time when you're saying, there's a ghost story and this is blowing up? Are the directors like, maybe we should talk about politics instead of a ghost?
No, actually, the funny part about it is that the only ones who were enthusiastic about covering this at Channel 5 were myself and Mark Monsky, the news director at the time. But Mark had an incredible sense of what was going to be good TV. At that time, one of the mantras was, if it bleeds, it leads. And in this case, I guess if it floats, it floats.
No, you got to say if it boos, it's news, right? Yeah. For ghost stories.
But it was incredible, because from the first story, first time we aired the story, the public couldn't get enough of it. I mean, and I remember after the 2-part series ran with Marvin Scott and myself with the covering the seance with the Warrens, the phones just lit up, and Mark Monsky thought that the audience was going to be saturated with the story. He goes, okay, well, we've done that house to death. Nobody wants to hear about it anymore. That's right up there with, TV is never going to supplant radio, and men will never walk on the moon, and the earth is flat. So the public's appetite for Amityville and anything connected with it has never been sated. And in fact, with each successive generation, I mean, Eric and Blaine are both second generation Amityville aficionados. And now after them, there's third and fourth generation. I get letters from people stamped self-addressed envelopes asking me for my autograph. And they even say, here, they've downloaded my picture from the internet. They send me Sharpie pens and say, do this. But I don't know why this one house is the focal point for so much fascination, but the area is rich in history, Native American, New York history, you name it. And now murders in Amityville, It still hasn't happened, by the way. I don't think that there have been more than 1 or 2 murders in the 45 years since.
Wow. Val Glow asks, how many times have Amityville house owners let the public investigators into the house? Blaine, what do you know about that?
It's been very rare since the late 1970s. The Cromartie family who lived there, they were they went on a publicity tour, if you will, in their own house, trying to disprove the claims of the haunting. But realistically, since that point, since the late 1970s, there hasn't been anybody. None of the families have wanted anything to do with this story. And I think the Cromartie family who lived there, they had done everything they could to try to dispel the myths and the rumors about this case. And I think the families subsequently after that who purchased the house just didn't want to deal with it. So they've denied repeated requests for television crews and other paranormal investigators to get into the house over the years.
You had the luxury of being able to go to the house and investigate it and research it and experiment a little bit. I don't want you to tell how that happened because I don't want people bothering anybody that owns a house or past owners. But when you got the chance to go into the home, I know you were there more kind of on the research of the DeFeo family murders. Paranormal wise, did they open up to you at all about any strange activity? Did any of the families, since the Cromarties, have anything strange happen there? And did you have anything happen?
Well, to answer your first question, so the previous owners that lived there claimed that nothing ever happened. She even joked to me about, when the house was for sale, how she wanted to put skeletons in the closet to kind of make fun of the idea that this house was haunted. And so her husband had unfortunately passed away, and that was part of the reason why she was selling the house. He didn't pass away in the house, but he had passed away. And so she made it very clear to me that nothing had happened to her. And, for me, I've been a paranormal investigator for about 20 years now. And I think all good paranormal investigators, what they want to do is they want to go in and try to immediately disprove or debunk whatever they can, because then whatever you're left with is the unknown. It's things that we can't explain, and we can rely a little bit more on that could be potentially paranormal activity. So when I went into that house, I had that in mind, that, I was obviously entering one of the most famous, if not the most famous haunted house in the world, or, rumored haunted houses in the world. And I had a few peculiar things that happened to me. And again, as a paranormal investigator, I can't necessarily call them paranormal. But there were a few things that happened throughout my time while I was there that did lead me to believe that there was something weird happening. And I'll give you one story in particular. So when I got to the house, I arrived, and as I entered, I was met by the owner, and there were a couple others that were there. The house was in the process of being sold, so it was basically empty of furniture, and she was doing some cleaning. And when I walked into the foyer, I became incredibly dizzy and almost as if my equilibrium was thrown off in a way. And being a paranormal investigator, I've experienced that in other haunted locations. There's a location, Dave, that I know you've been to many times, the Palmer House Hotel here in Minnesota. And there's a specific spot in that hotel that I can walk through that I get that same sensation, that same feeling of dizziness. Now, I don't claim to be psychic. I don't claim to have any sort of psychic abilities whatsoever. But I walked into that house and I got that same dizziness for just a few short seconds. And I just sort of chalked it up to, hey, I'm really excited to be here. That's probably what it is. And sort of that skeptical side of me downplayed that experience. And what ended up happening within a year after me getting in the house, I was interviewing actually a friend of George Lutz's, and somebody who had been in the house multiple times while they were living there. He claims that he experienced paranormal activity while he was there. And he said to me, he said, when you got in there, did you get really sick to your stomach or anything like that? And I said, well, what do you mean? And he said, every time I went into that house, I got incredibly sick to my stomach. He even talked about having to vomit one time when he was there. And he said he became incredibly dizzy. And I said, well, where did that happen? And he said, I was in the foyer as soon as I would walk in. So I thought that was really interesting. I can't sit back and say that was 100% paranormal. And I'm not even claiming that it was paranormal, but it was just a very strange thing that happened. And then to talk to somebody who had a very similar experience to me 40 some years prior, it was pretty interesting.
I want to thank you guys. You've stayed much longer than I had asked. We'll wrap it up here in 10 minutes just to cut it off at the 2-hour mark. And I want to give everybody a chance for their final comments. I do like this one from Anne. And I'm sorry I didn't get to questions from the audience, folks. We had so many great speakers and so many points to hit on. And I still feel like we just gave you the glossy sheen of this case. Anne Irish Bale says, haunted or not, why would you buy and live in a house that had such a horrific murder take place in it? I've often laughed because I think, why are these people so mad that people are standing outside their house? When you buy the Amityville Horror house, you have to kind of give up the righteous indignation of get off my lawn. You've got to kind of understand. It's like, buying Disney World and then being pissed off that every kid in the world wants to come by. This is the mecca of paranormal legend and lore. Before we head out for the evening, I just want to kind of get each one of your takes of what this case means. And I also want to make a public ask to you, Blaine. We, of course, do a true crime program every Tuesday because you're so entrenched in the DeFeo story, and we didn't get a chance to dive that deep into all of those aspects and your research. And I know that you did some tests in that house to try to figure some things out. I'd love for you to come back and spend 90 minutes with us talking about the DeFeo murders, getting more in depth about the crime itself and some of the mystery surrounding it. Would you do that for us?
Absolutely. Anytime.
Great. All right. I appreciate that. Alex, your dad, this was a major case in his files. This was something that, he'll always be associated with. Looking at it as a paranormal investigator and as a medium and sensitive yourself, what does this case mean, do you think, to the world as a paranormal subject? Is it something that, should be summarily dismissed at this point? Or what do you take away? What do you think your father's main takeaway was on this?
Well, when he wrote Murder in Amityville, which was turned into Amityville 2: The Possession, they really tried to stick close to the angry Indian chief spirit, but it didn't really come out that way. And I think it got to a point where he just didn't want anything to do with it. In fact, he was really very insulted that people started to know who he was because of that case. That he had so many other great cases and all over Europe and also in the States. And it's kind of like an insult to the intellect and the academia of the world that we come from in cyclical research, So he really wanted to disconnect from it. I have obviously all the work here. And when we went through his business letters and dealings about Amityville and trying to talk to Butch and saying that he's truly possessed and stuff, I don't doubt that something was going on to further fuel that fire of a negative soul, if you will. But, we weren't there. And that was his moment in that time. And, Laura was there. And I kind of feel like we need to put this to rest and walk away, because there's other murder houses around the world that these things happen to. And it's sickening. And I feel like if we're going to add fuel to that fire, then we're responsible for letting that negative energy linger somehow, some way. I don't know. I just think it's terrible. And I know he wouldn't want anything to do with that.
Your father's books are coming back in print. You've been releasing quite a few, so people can find those on Amazon.com. Can they find them? Do you have a storefront or anything they can go?
No, it's literally like Amazon is the storefront, and because we're down to 3 publishers, and it's easiest for them, so that's how we're doing it. But there's a lot of redone books that we've had from like the 60s and 70s and 80s, and we're still doing a lot more. We're I think like 40% done out of 100%. So, and mine's going to go up there as well. It is what it is. But we do have
don't be dismissive. You've got a great book and you've got a new one that you're working on. So you're not just in your father's shadow. You are your own person.
I know. Honey, I know that. Trust me.
All right. How can people find more information about you and get readings and get your book?
Sure. Well, I have, I'm on the social media, the Twitter, the Instagram, the Facebook, all that silly stuff that I can't stand. And then I have alexandraholzer.com. And I always talk to people, even when I'm dealing with the 4-year-old and the other children. I take the time because I'm very interested in people. And if they're good people, I'll talk to them. If not, then I just hit block. No offense. Not you guys. Relax.
All right.
I don't like social media. I really don't care, to be honest with you. But
But you can check out our website. We'll have it on today's episode as well. You and I will be talking again because we've got, I think, 5 or 6 episodes left from season 1 that we need to do Holzer's Ghosts on to re-examine. We'll be coming back next Thursday and going back into the TV series season 1, the 5 or 6 episodes we didn't get a chance to do one of these programs for. Laura, what does Amityville mean to you, and what do you think it means to the pantheon of the paranormal overall?
Well, what it means to me, I don't know. I'm very, very closely associated with it now because I was one of the youngest when it happened. Now I'm one of the few who's alive and, not terribly ancient. I mean, certainly in the pantheon of haunted houses, horror stories, demonic possession, however, someone would like to characterize it, it stands out there as sort of like the apex or the granddaddy of the genre. That's not going to change. The public's fascination for this is the appetite is just, unquenchable thirst for more. But I agree with Alexandra. There are so many more out there, and plug, one of the best books ever. And it was a book that my mother brought home when I was about 8 or 9. Was Hans Holzer's The Ghost Hunter. Start there. And then there's another great book that Hans did, and I talked to him about this at length, The Lively Ghosts of Ireland, which is very, very close to my heart because I'm half Irish. And my granny was born there, and I've spent a lot of time there. And Hans Holzer of course, the British Isles, Ireland, the whole Celtic, Scottish thing. There's a lot going on there. That's another good one. But I'd like to see more. There are so many places and so many experiences. So I'd like to hear more about that. But I suspect until Hollywood comes calling, and now that we have a lot of the streaming services, we're going to keep hearing about Amityville,
right?
And a few others,
Blaine, looking at the true crime aspect of it, the haunting, the both elements come together. How has this case impacted you? Obviously, you've spent 20 years digging into it. What's your takeaway from Amityville?
Well, I think Amityville is one of those stories that it fascinates the public, and it's a lot like the JFK assassination or Roswell. It's just a story that really will just continue to rear its ugly head, so to speak. Every few years, there'll be a new movie, there'll be a new documentary, there'll be a new book. And for me, I think the reason I continue to look into this case is because there are still mysteries connected to this story. There are still things that haven't been completely told or uncovered. And I think, Christopher is a perfect example of that there is a story there to tell. And so for me, it's exciting to think that, and hope that there will come a day where he will tell that story and answer some of those questions that I've had for the last 20 plus years.
And Eric, again, you've had a unique perspective on this case, working with Daniel and sorting through the real histories of this. What was the biggest surprise to you in the Amityville Horror?
Just as I mentioned, from working on my Amityville Horror, definitely the impact psychologically that this had on Daniel's life. And, and again, I think each child certainly had their own story to tell, but this being this kind of just secular viewpoint of Daniel's experience, he was traumatized by this. And again, as I said earlier, I think that is, whether it was a hoax or not, whatever your belief is, I think there's no more proof you can give to anyone than seeing the look on his face, the look in his eyes. While I do think there were aspects that were played up for the camera, and, we can debate about what those specific instances were, I do think that there was something very real that happened to them in that house. And I think my lingering fascination, to echo a little bit of what Blaine said, is that there are still, even despite my documentary, despite the research that's being done, still continues to this day, there have been a lot of aspects of this that have become more minutia, that interest me, even within the Lutz's account of what happened, that aren't focused on. And I think just the controversy in and of itself is actually what always drew me to get involved or want to seek out this story, because of the initial controversy of people like Stephen Kaplan getting involved and trying to debunk, and then subsequently writing a book, The Amityville Horror Conspiracy. There were kind of people riding the coattails of the Lutz's story's success, right, if you will. And so, and of course, this happens within many cases, but Amityville was just the compendium, the textbook example of just a complete circus act. What the entire town itself is not only the house, but the town itself is just known for being a town of horror, which is sad. And I know that certainly my documentary and every book or film or TV show that comes out just perpetuates that. But my focus is definitely getting testimony documented and out there that hasn't been told, as well as uncovering actual fact that happened. And again, with my Amityville Horror documentary, it was never my intention to try to say, hey, this absolutely happened. This was Daniel's truth. I don't know what the truth, I don't know what actually happened, but it's his story to tell. And at the end of the day, I do think that they all very, deeply were affected by what happened there.
And I'd like to address that fact to the audience. When you come upon any of these survivors from paranormal encounters, be kind and respectful. You might not believe the story. Sometimes the people's story is just as fascinating as to why they believe these things are true. I've been there and watched people be dismissive to Christopher, and I've seen it with Daniel and other people involved in this. They took the brunt of something they had no hand in. And, I know those two boys had to fight most of their lives because they were the hoaxer kids, the Amityville kids, and their family was put down. Their mother was called a liar and horrible names. And these boys battled. And you mentioned, Eric, in talking to Daniel, there were elements you could tell that there was something majorly traumatic. The same with me talking with Christopher when we're in person doing these events. I liken it to my grandfather, who was a World War II veteran, a paratrooper who made 3 of the 4 major drops and saw the shitstorm of a war. When my grandfather would start talking, you could see him gloss over, and he was there. And when Christopher tells me these stories, you can tell me all you want, it was a hoax. I can see in this man's eyes and mind that he's back and that he's still terrorized by what happened to him as a child. Whether you believe it to be real or not, their perception is that these things happen to them. So be kind, be respectful, and check out these documentaries. And please, folks, don't send me emails about how you know more and these people are all mental and they don't know anything. And this is, your feet weren't on the ground. You didn't investigate. You haven't been in the house. You didn't talk to the people. So don't tell me how you know better than everybody that we've spoken to. Show respect and kindness. You can weigh in with opinions, which are always welcome. But even watching some of the comments before tonight's program, I don't know why there's an interest. This is all fake and fraud, and everybody involved is a money monger. One of the big things you should know, the money mongers, the George and Kathy Lutz, they cashed in for very little, and they gave up a lot, and so did their family in telling this story. They didn't get the cash cow that you think that they would have. They didn't make the kind of 2020 money people get for selling their stories. And I got news for you. I have friends like Carmen Snedeker and Andrea Perrin. They didn't make money selling their stories to big Hollywood stories. It's not what you think. So don't dismiss them offhandedly, and give them some leeway, because Hollywood will bastardize these true tales. So again, Eric, how can people find you and your documentary? What's the best way to locate you?
The documentary is pretty much available everywhere, streaming services, Amazon Prime. You can go to myamityvillehorror.com, as well as my website, ericwalterdocs.com, to look at my work as well.
Blaine, do you have a website people should visit? Anything that you want to share at this point?
No, other than, Eric and I used to run amityvillefiles.com, which is still available. There's a lot of content that's on there. I believe people can still get a hold of me through that website if they'd like to for any questions that they may have.
Excellent. Laura, anything you need to promote before we let you go?
Well, I am, they can find me on social media. And finally, after many years and people asking me, I am getting ready to publish a book within the year on my experiences in Amityville and what happened during the time that we went in and the whole circus around that.
Excellent. Well, thank you all, and thank you for staying over time with us. Thank you to Tim Yancey, who was possessed by the Amityville curse tonight and couldn't stay with us and disconnected again. You can find his original episodes with us in our archives. We'll be back again next week with brand new episodes of the best in paranormal talk radio. Stay safe, be kind, love one another, enjoy your life. You never know when your time will be called upon. So thank you for spending your time with us here on the show this evening, everyone on our panel and all of you listeners who've hung in and all your great comments throughout the show. We'll see you again next week right here on the best in paranormal talk radio. I'm Dave Schrader.